So, I wanted to do a video on intuition today. And the concept of intuition is strongly linked to creativity for me. And I wanted to do a video really on intuition, but I think necessarily on both concepts because people have recently asked me about them. To some who know me well, I'm known as a person who receives and follows intuition. And to others, I'm known as a creative person, a person who always has projects that he's pursuing and putting out into the world, so who is sort of in that flow. And intuition is a kind of flow as well. Intuition arrives, appears, we receive it, and we can learn to act from it. We can learn to trust it, even though it doesn't have the same sort of logic that we are trained to rely on through our schooling system. In my experience, it arrives divorced of logic. It simply presents an unquestionable truth. Here's the way events are going to proceed, or perhaps here's a truth about another person. We may encounter another person and have an intuition about their motives. And so intuition simply delivers a truth which we don't even experience an inclination to question. It simply is. It is known. And so the question is, how do we awaken this faculty? And then how do we trust it? What does it mean to trust it? And so I think really the preliminary question is, what is happening when we experience an intuition? What is occurring? I've characterized it already as a sense of flow, akin to creativity. Something arrives, something passes through us. So to expand this notion a little bit, I'll say that intuition is knowledge being given to and passing through the self, the individual self. I experience myself as Jackson, who has a story of his past and hopes, and in this case, in the case of intuition, premonitions about his future. And in my last video, I covered at length how the self is created and what then happens to the self throughout its lifetime as a result of its nature. So I'm speaking to that same concept, to that same ground when I treat intuition. So intuition is knowledge given to this individual self or channeled through it. I've mentioned this a few times already, or at least alluded to it, but this is the same way that, in my experience, creativity functions. I think any serious artist would agree that what inspiration really feels like is it's almost someone else or some higher intelligence doing or creating the art through us. So there is some greater source of energy that finds me, Jackson, as its vessel, as its expression. And of course, what I create then bears the marks of my unique and individual personality, but the energy that fueled it comes from something far greater than me, and that does not seem to have the restrictions of a human personality. So intuition is the same way. How do I know? Even though I have a puny human mind that cannot possibly know the future or so rapidly detect something like the motives of another person in the present moment, because this knowledge is given to me from without. So just as in creativity, that's the nature of intuition. The last video felt very momentous to me and felt like a marathon. You know, it took a long time. I don't want this video to be as long, and I want it to feel more casual. And so one way of kind of reminding myself that it was to bring a cup of coffee along. I was like, okay, I'm just sitting down, talking to the camera with a cup of coffee. It's no big deal. So I don't know if that will change the vibe of the video or allow me to relax more. I felt just very serious about the other video. I suppose I was communicating serious things, but anyway, that's the intention behind the cup of coffee. So, intuition has this character of knowledge being delivered to us from some higher source. It's not necessary to the experience of intuition to explain what that source is. But I want to treat intuition from two perspectives later on in this video, and so it's necessary for me to explore that source a little bit. In my previous video, I talked not only about the individual self, which is constructed through trauma, and as a reminder, in case you didn't watch that video, I use the word trauma loosely. What I really mean is pain that the individual self experiences, plus the message that for some reason it deserves that pain. And that reason becomes perpetuated in a narrative which is synonymous with the individual self. So these are narratives like, I am bad, I am wrong, I am too short, I am ugly, I am mean. These I messages we carry about ourselves, which inframe our awareness and delimit us as individual beings. It's very snowy outside today, so driving at that speed is unusually dangerous. So yes, this is the structure of the individual self that receives the intuition. It is this consciousness narrowed into a singular entity through trauma. As I also spoke about in the other video, my previous video, our fundamental nature is as oneness, is as a universality, a single consciousness that pervades all beings. I don't remember touching on this in the previous video, but there's actually a quite simple logical exploration through which to arrive at this truth. Many teachers have spoken about coming into contact with the soul. Some call it the witness, which I think is intentional because it sounds less mystical to scientific ears. The witness sounds like it could simply mean the mind, which is something that even the scientists can believe in. The witness, or the soul, is what stands in back of all our experiences, including our very self. There is an energy watching, experiencing. As I discussed in the previous video, this energy is dispassionate. It enjoys the experience it receives, but not in a way that signals attachment to that experience. Any experience would suffice. The soul is happy to go along. Something I think quite often that for some reason makes me smile is that the soul is just happy to be having an experience. I think this reminds me in moments where I stress out about the ramifications of my choices, that those ramifications matter only to the individual self, which applies weight to its experience in an attempt to solve its register of pain. A lot of our choices, I think, boil down to that, as the individual, limited, traumatized self. If I do this, I will experience less pain, or so I believe, and that's why I'm going to do it. Because the past experience has quite a bit of pain for almost any individual self. So the soul is this dispassionate, watching energy. And if we really pare down the qualities of that soul, we will see that it's more correct to say they're the absence of any quality. Anything we could define the soul as would fix it in an arbitrary way, would make it static, which is untrue of its nature. It is a flow, an ephemerality. And so what we'll then see is that any person, and not only any person, but any plant or animal or even inanimate object who conducts this same inquiry within them or itself will arrive at the same soul. And so, are there multiple souls, or is there only one soul, pervading all beings, experiencing itself as different individuals? For what reason? I don't know. I hazarded a reason in my previous video. But if there's one part of that video that feels more dubious to me than others, that's the part. The fact is that our universe is this composite of myriad or multiple beings through which the singular soul is experiencing itself. And as to why that is, there are moments where it feels obvious or feels that we have an answer, but there are moments like this one now for me where the equation feels more mysterious. Anyway, I've gone on at some length already in what was supposed to be a shorter video. But the point here is to say that the source of intuition is the soul, if the recipient of it is the individual self. This is how knowledge suddenly appears, and the self not only could not begin to question it, there's no rational basis to question the intuition, but need not question it. It arrives with finality. It simply feels true. We know that when we register an artistic or intuitive truth on someone else's behalf as well. There's that feeling that we all seem to be able to tap into. It just feels true. It's like the moon being made of cheese. Some of these are absurd, but they have a feeling to them that's unmistakable. So the claim is that intuition, just as artistry, flows from the soul, or from the higher singular self, into and through the individual self. Something I'm concerned with doing in my videos, and I suppose in my teaching generally, is demystifying supposedly arcane faculties. This is in the same way that Prometheus, if you're familiar with Greek mythology, brought fire down to the humans from the gods. And as we know, he was castigated for this. He was punished for all eternity, which I think is an important aspect of the myth. I seek to remind people that divine powers are available within us all, and in fact, that there's nothing so mysterious about them. This is because in my own life, the more I brand my intelligences, my faculties as normal, the greater good I become able to do in the world. Because then I am no longer ashamed of myself and instead able to share myself in ways that contribute to the whole. And so this normalization of high faculties, for instance with intuition, we might associate it with certain clairvoyants, among whom there are quacks, people who abuse this power. I seek to de-elevate gifts like this, to remind us that they are available to us all, and indeed are part of the structure of our being, of reality. So that is one of the intentions here. So, the reason intuition delivers knowledge not only of the future, but also in the present moment of things that the rational mind couldn't possibly know, is that intuition arrives from the soul. And the soul does know these things, because the soul pervades, is synonymous with all beings. The soul is me not only in the present, but me at 80 years old. Therefore, I may have an intuition about my future from here to 80. Maybe it involves Botox. Just seemed funny to say in that moment. Similarly, in the other example I keep giving, I may receive an intuition about the motive or deep feeling of another person with whom I am in contact. Why? Because the soul pervades that other person as well. For the soul which I am a part of or share, there is no distinction between myself and that other person. Therefore, intuition is a moment of breach between the individual self and the singular or universal soul. It's simply a moment when the soul overshadows the self, therefore becoming able to hand off its knowledge, or channel its knowledge through the self. I was thinking because with teachings like this, there's often a desire to apply prescriptions. How do we tap into this? How do we ready ourselves for it? And there is something I can offer in that regard. However, I was also thinking, the soul overshadows the self when it wants to. I spoke of free will at the end of my previous video, and intuition is one area where that starts to disappear or becomes challenged. Our certainty about free will may be one of the things we lose along the path to intuition, because intuition is telling me what the future is going to be. Doesn't sound like I have much of a choice, do I? Even if I have an intuition about a future and then choose to avoid that future. I'm thinking now of Luke in Star Wars, right, who has a premonition of himself joining the dark side, becoming the next Darth Vader, and then chooses not to do that. The intuition still restricts the future, showing us what could be along one path, if it's a terrible path. This precludes our taking that path. We're going to take a different path. So, our certainty about our ability to choose may be one of the things that disappears with intuition. In terms of prescriptions, how do we ready ourselves for this? Well, as I've laid it out, it's a quite natural phenomenon. It is simply the soul bequeathing its knowledge to the individual self. And the soul is our birthright. We are all a part of it, no matter what we do, and no matter how we may forget. So again, there's nothing abnormal, there's nothing majestic about this faculty of intuition, the arrival of this kind of knowledge. However, there are myriad obstacles to coming to understand it as so natural a thing. The big one that comes to me is this. Especially because intuition is so often associated with foreknowledge of the future, why would that be something I was resistant to? I think most people are resistant to intuition or have blocked this faculty in themselves. Why would that be so? Well, when we review our past, isn't it the case that most of us find that past riddled with negative events? Time and again in life, we've experienced that my present moment, when I think things are going so well, transitions into a painful future moment where the things I am enjoying are lost, or where I am ashamed of myself or do something I regret. We've seen that again and again, and all of those examples of our situation deteriorating, these are gathered into our past in the form of memory. So having a negative outlook on or association with my past, won't I be disinclined to receive intuitions about the future? Won't I look on the future as a scary thing that will certainly reproduce the negativity of the past? This, I think, is what stymies the arrival of intuition, or stanches it. And it's really fear as a result of pain incurred by the past and held in the present. And so, if there is a path to unlocking intuition, it is through acceptance of the past, which is really forgiveness of the self. A different phrasing of this last bit is love of the self. If I love myself, I accept who I am, and part of who I am is the story of my past. It is essential, because not only am I a soul, I am a soul experiencing itself as an individual being with a story. And so, many people who perhaps want to access their intuition and have trouble with it, I think also have trouble with their past. And this is no less true of me. Things from my past are always bubbling up and being resolved in the present, being forgiven, being accepted. So, this is a lifelong process. In Buddhism they call it an unraveling of the story of self that happens with awareness. To those seeking to forgive the past, to dissipate fear of the future, I do have one recommendation. And again, it has to do with letting go of free will. Already, in expressing my teachings, I've encountered some resistance when sharing this, because I will often challenge or express skepticism toward this notion of free will. I think a more refined way than I've expressed it before is not saying that I don't believe the individual self has choice, but rather saying what I believe I've said already in this video, which is that from the vantage of the soul, it does not matter. The soul is here to have an individual experience. That is its intention and the seat of its joy. And from that perspective, there is no wrong choice that the individual self can make, because any and all choices will generate experience for the soul. And so, rather than debunking free will, it is seeing the irrelevancy of it. At the absolute level, it does not matter. When we review our past with that disposition, when we remove the variable of choice from our past, we will no longer blame ourselves for things that happen. As I've said not only in this video, but in my previous video, trauma is what encases pain in the self. And trauma usually boils down to guilt or shame, because it is a belief that I deserve whatever happened because I did something wrong. If we remove the variable of free will or choice, that conclusion disappears. It becomes illogical. Things simply happen to us. I've spoken in abstraction a fair amount in this video, so I'll give an example. Say we grew up in poverty and we're ashamed of that. Taking away the variable of free will tells us, well, it happened. We didn't do anything to deserve it. It was simply there. Perhaps we worked our way out of it. Perhaps we live in poverty still. As Robin Williams' character says to Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting, it's not your fault. This is what we know when we remove the variable of free will. Even as a thought experiment, even if you don't believe it, I suggest trying it. And just as a reminder, the reason I bring this up within the context of this video is that alleviating our regret or self-blame over the past is what will unlock our receptivity to the future. And that is what intuition, generally speaking, is about. It's reception in advance of knowledge of the future, foreknowledge of the future. Now, I said a while ago, when I went on at some length about the nature and structure of the soul versus the individual self, that I was doing that in order to prep myself to comment on intuition from twin perspectives later on. The first perspective was that of the individual self, and I just covered it. The individual self can receive intuition from the soul about its future, and it becomes more keen to accept and trust this knowledge once it has let go of regret over the past, once it has forgiven itself, accepted its past, and healed in that regard. Because then the future becomes a less scary prospect. And I've experienced this in my own life through healing. Now, commenting on intuition from the perspective of the soul doesn't care. The soul could care less about what is going to happen. And I've already alluded a few times to why this is so. The soul is simply here to have an experience. And so, a funny thing about unlocking or accessing our intuition is that the very means by which we do it, which is coming into greater contact with our soul, is simultaneously the means by which we diminish our interest in that faculty. I don't have a live transcript of what I'm saying, but I feel that was an indecipherable sentence. So let me see if I can unpack it a little more. The means by which we come to intuition, which is familiarity with our soul, is also what makes us lose interest in using intuition. Because whether or not I've had foreknowledge of the coming moment, that moment will still come, and my soul will still be there when it does, grateful to have the experience. And so in an odd way, seeking to develop and then applying intuition is a route through which we lose interest in intuition and come more fully into the present moment. I spoke a while ago about Prometheus and wanting to remind people of their innate powers. It's almost like once we realize and use the superhuman powers we have been given by birthright as human beings, we pretty quickly lose interest in them and simply want to have a more normal or mundane experience. Because why does it matter? The soul doesn't care. The soul is content. It's like me drinking coffee, but if I were in a robe, which I don't want to subject you to, so I haven't. But maybe you're imagining it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say. I don't think there is really. Thank you for listening.